How do we define a mystery? To the good people of New Mexico and many others involved in what we have termed the ultimate cold case file, it can be defined in a single word: Roswell. Well, that's from the preface of The Roswell Incident, an eyewitness account by Thomas J. Carey and Donald R. Schmidt.
The 1947 Roswell incident is, in many ways, the first modern conspiracy theory. There's government intrigue, aliens, cover-ups, and hundreds of conflicting accounts. While this book was published in 2009, originally called Witness to Roswell: Unmasking the Government's Biggest Cover-Up, Carey and Schmidt have been trying to expose the truth about Roswell since 1980.
And they aren't alone. Most of the prominent Roswell researchers have been at it for decades. The ultimate cold case is right.
Even the most benign details of the case have been worked over, revised, interpreted, and misinterpreted. And the obsession only makes the official version of the story seem even odder. In July 1947, an object crashed outside of Roswell, New Mexico. A rancher found the debris, and the military, after a bit of confusion, informed him that it was a weather balloon.
So why is the incident still considered a mystery? Why can't eyewitnesses agree on even the most basic details of what happened? Why has such a simple story taken over an entire town? And why are there still people dedicating their lives to finding the truth?
Conspiracy? Maybe. Coincidence? Maybe. Complicated?
Absolutely.
Today we're talking about the Roswell incident. According to the official story, in July 1947, a rancher uncovered debris on his property, and the Army quickly confirmed that it was only a crashed weather balloon. But, as it was later revealed, that wasn't exactly true.
Next week, we'll unpack the multitudes of conspiracy theories around the crash. We'll look at a star witness whose credibility was constantly in doubt.
We'll look at additional crash sites where supposedly live aliens were found, and the mysterious story of a mortician who was asked for coffins that could fit alien bodies.
We'll also examine the ufologists who have dedicated their lives to answering the fundamental question of the investigation. Was it aliens?
If you go to Roswell, New Mexico today, you'll find a pleasant, mid-sized city with all the trappings of your usual American metropolis. McDonald's, Walmart, long strips of storefronts.
You'll also find a lot of alien paraphernalia. Most fast food restaurants have drawings of little green men in their windows. There are countless signs reading, "Aliens Welcome." One McDonald's is even shaped like an old-school UFO.
You can also check out the International UFO Museum, which is packed with statues and dioramas ready-made for an ironic Instagram post. It's probably the only place in America where you can get a picture of yourself playing foosball against an alien.
In short, the town is well aware of how synonymous it is with aliens. Whether you're a skeptic or a believer, Roswell is happy to make money off of you.
Which may be a recurring theme when we start examining why there are so many different theories about what happened there.
But before we get into that, we have to understand what Roswell was like in 1947, when it was just ranchers, farmers, and a small Air Force base.
If you've ever been out in the desert, you'll know that the sky is different out there. It can be clear, but the light of the moon bouncing off clouds or a pair of headlights in the distance can throw up some surreal reflections. Picture wide-open plains, stars as far as the eye can see, moonlit evenings.
And make sure to spend a long time picturing it, because in 1947, that's about all there was out there. There was no internet, no TV, and only a couple of radio stations. The main sources for news, along with neighbors or the newspaper.
To give you an idea of just how much less there was going on, if you look at the Billboard Top 10 for July 6, 1947, 5 of the 10 songs on the chart are covers of a song called Peg O' My Heart.
Despite all this, Roswell wasn't as sleepy as it could have been, largely due to the military base in town. It was the headquarters of, among other things, the 509th Bombardment Group, the wing of the Air Force, who just 2 years prior had dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The military presence, along with the Cold War slowly coming into focus, may have made the people of Roswell a little more paranoid, a little more on edge, a little more conspiratorial.
This is also the same time when the UFO wave of 1947 kicked off, beginning with the first report of a flying saucer just a couple weeks prior in Mount Rainier, Washington. The UFO wave accounts for somewhere between, per the official government estimation, 16 and 800 sightings in the same 8-week period in mid-1947.
Not exactly a precise estimate.
As we try to unpack the official version of the Roswell incident, keep that disparity in mind. This is a story full of wiggle room. While most people agree on a rough timeline, the details have been so disputed that it may not be possible to tell you the official order of events.
The theories behind what happened during and after the incident have become so nuanced that the times and dates, sometimes down to the hour, change depending on who you ask. But we'll do the best we can to keep the facts straight.
What we know for sure is something crashed near the property of W.W. Brazel, generally known as Mac, around town. Mac was in his 40s, handsome, a rancher. Most of the people who described him referred to him as an old cowboy. He uncovered the debris from the crash on his ranch, which, even for this area of New Mexico, is really in the middle of nowhere. If you go out there now, it's all flat plains and the same tiny houses from when Mac lived there.
Even though the story hasn't begun, we're already running into problems. We don't really have any idea when the wreckage crashed or exactly when Mac found it.
We're off to a great start. The best we can figure out without delving into the various timelines put forward by pro-Roswell conspiracy researchers is to say that the crash and Mac's initial discovery occurred between June 14th and July 4th, 1947. He was wandering around his property, about 8 miles from the ranch house, with either his son Vernon or a neighbor boy named D. Proctor.
While there are varying descriptions of what exactly Mac found and where precisely it was, this quote from the Roswell Daily Review on July 9th, 1947, is from an interview with him, and it's the closest thing we have to an official primary source. Mac described the debris as a large area of bright wreckage made up of rubber strips, tinfoil, a rather tough paper, and sticks. In all, he estimated, the entire lot would have weighed maybe 5 pounds. There was no sign of any metal in the area which might have been used for an engine. There was no words to be found anywhere on the instrument, although there were letters on some of the parts. Considerable Scotch tape and some tape with flowers printed upon it had been used in the construction.
Now, from that, I'm thinking that if there were any aliens involved in that wreck, they were pretty small and really lo-fi.
Scotch tape isn't exactly otherworldly.
Sure. If that's truly the extent of the wreckage, then I think the impulse to rule out aliens is fair. If that's the extent of the wreckage.
Officially, this is all Mac found, and this is my favorite part of the entire story. No matter what timeline you follow, there's mostly a consensus on what Mac did after he uncovered the debris. Nothing. He ignored it and went on ranching. He didn't pick up any of the wreckage or tell anyone for at least a few days.
According to the Roswell Daily Review article, Mac was prompted to take another look at the wreckage when he heard the first reports of flying discs, as they were known. This would have been only a few days after the first sighting at Mount Rainier, but it's unclear what specific incident Mac would have heard about.
It's difficult to get a picture of Mac's emotional state at this point, but from the newspaper article, you get the impression that he's treating the wreckage as an idle curiosity, something to disrupt the doldrums of ranch life. He picked up some of it with his family, and a few days later, he went into Roswell proper.
Again, the timeline on this is a little foggy, but Mac most likely went into Roswell on July 7th, a Monday. If that sounds arbitrary, we'll have a few arguments in part 2 that'll tell you otherwise.
From there, Mac approached the local sheriff, George Wilcox. At some point, Mac may have let the flying disc hype get to him, as he describes himself as telling Wilcox about the wreckage, kind of confidential-like. While Mac was giving his statement to Wilcox, something a little odd happened. Judd Roberts, the co-owner of a local radio station, KGFL, called Sheriff Wilcox to ask if he had anything newsworthy to report, and Roberts and Mac briefly talked about the wreckage. This seems a little inconsequential, and maybe it is.
However, there's a lot of debate about what exactly Roberts and Mac discussed during that phone call and during a subsequent radio interview. Some claim that Mac told KGFL point blank that he saw aliens.
Whatever they discussed, Sheriff Wilcox, confounded by the wreckage, called the Roswell Army Airfield to pass on the information. This introduced perhaps the most important character of the entire incident, an intelligence officer named Major Jesse A. Marcel.
Well, the next day, July 8th, Major Marcel drove out to Mac's ranch with a man in plain clothes, to quote journalistic sources, to pick up the debris.
The man in plain clothes was Sheridan Cavett, and he's a very odd addition to the story. He's barely ever talked about in discussions of the Roswell incident. He was interviewed years later by UFO researchers and also by the Air Force, and depending on which of them you ask, he either wasn't at Roswell at all or had no idea of the significance of the find.
It's generally considered that Cavett helped Marcel and Mac gather up the wreckage, but the fact that he's such a footnote despite being a primary eyewitness of the incident is strange.
Maybe the ufologists ignore him because most of what he has to say on the matter is that nothing out of the ordinary happened.
Well, either way, Marcel, Mac, and Cavett gathered the wreckage, and they all sat down and tried to figure out what the heck the thing was. It was like a 3D jigsaw puzzle without a box. Unsurprisingly, they couldn't figure out how to put the pieces together.
From there, Marcel and Cavett did what any good military officer would do: give up and kick it over to their superiors.
They drove the wreckage back to their base in Roswell proper. From there, the order of events isn't really clear. The best facts we can give you are that Marcel showed the wreckage to his commanding officer, Colonel William Blanchard, and at some point, Blanchard punted the wreckage up to his superior, General Roger Ramey in Fort Worth, Texas.
Ramey had the debris flown to Fort Worth, and that may have been the end of it, if it weren't for a fateful order from Blanchard.
Blanchard approached Walter Hott, a public information officer on the base, and ordered him to put out a press release about the events.
The release said, and I quote, "The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence officer of the 508th Bomb Group was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc."
The headline that ran only half an hour later read, "RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell Region." The U.S. military had confirmed publicly that they had a flying saucer.
On July 8, 1947, after receiving the wreckage found on Mac Brazel's ranch, the RAAF told the press that they had a flying disc. It hit headlines across Roswell, then across America. The genie's out of the bottle now. We've got the Air Force talking about aliens.
Well, no. There's a lot to unpack during the few hours after the articles appeared, but first, we need to give some really important context regarding flying discs and UFOs. UFO literally means unidentified flying object, and flying discs or flying saucers are just that.
So, if someone in the military says they saw a UFO, that means they saw a flying object that was unidentified.
It could be a flock of geese, or a stealth bomber, or even a weather balloon. And as far as flying discs go, the terminology comes from Kenneth Arnold's report in Mount Rainier just weeks before the Roswell incident, where he saw discs in the sky that appeared to be flying. As far as America was concerned, in July 1947, a flying disc was just a disc that flew. Any association with alien spaceships and the like came months, if not years later.
Oh, well, that's no fun.
Sorry to burst your balloon, but we've got plenty of alien discussion ahead of us.
In the meantime, a lot happened very quickly after the first reports of a flying disc hit the press.
Well, the pieces of the wreckage were on their way to Fort Worth to be inspected by General Ramey. Ramey was the superior of both Major Marcel, one of the officers who picked up the wreckage, and Colonel Blanchard, who had ordered the press release. Mac Brazel was quickly becoming a local celebrity, and he had a radio interview scheduled for that very evening.
Soon after the flying disc story was published, Marcel arrived at the Fort Worth base to meet with General Ramey and examine the wreckage together. This included taking photos.
Well, there's a great photo of Marcel holding a piece of the wreckage that looks like a huge piece of tinfoil. There's a lot of speculation about how these conversations went and what was really in the photos taken of the wreckage, particularly in regards to a memo that General Ramey is holding in one of the photos.
If we're sticking to the official version, those photos are about the only remarkable thing that happened at Fort Worth. General Ramey took one look at the debris and immediately identified it as being from a weather balloon.
In fact, the flying disc portion of the weather balloon was a radar reflector, which is what Marcel is holding up in the famous photo.
Just to be thorough, another officer, one Irving Newton, a weather officer at Fort Worth, was brought in to examine the material. Newton said later in an affidavit, quote, "I walked into the general's office where this supposed flying saucer was lying all over the floor. As soon as I saw it, I giggled and asked if that was the flying saucer. I told them that this was a balloon," end quote.
From there, Ramey doesn't waste much time getting out ahead of the flying disc story. HOT's original press release was published at 11 a.m. on July 8th, and by 4 p.m. that same day, Ramey was holding a press conference.
Even though the alien connotations didn't exist yet, there was still a serious furor over these mysterious flying discs. Sheriff Wilcox received calls from London, and the AP story about it reached as far as Tehran.
But the journalists at the press conference, who at this point were all pretty eager to hear more about the flying disc, got the wind taken out of them pretty swiftly. Ramey stated that the wreckage was from a standard weather balloon. The brilliant headline from the Roswell Daily Record, "Ramey empties Roswell saucer," sums up the mood nicely.
Even if we're sticking to the official version, we can tell you here and now that Ramey lied. As we'll learn later, the weather balloon explanation, whether you're a skeptic or a believer, was definitely 100% a cover-up.
What it was covering up is where the debate comes in.
Meanwhile, Mac Brazel was discovering that celebrity didn't agree with him. While Ramey was telling the press all the fuss was over nothing, Mac told his side of the story to another journalist. An article ran the next day in the Roswell Daily Record with the headline, quote, "Harassed rancher who located saucer, sorry he told about it," end quote. The majority of the article is just Mac reiterating what he found.
The part of the interview that sticks out and is still a major cause of debate is a line right at the end of the article. Brazel said that he had previously found 2 weather observation balloons on the ranch, but that what he found this time did not in any way resemble either of these. He said, quote, "I am sure that what I found was not any weather observation balloon. But if I find anything else besides a bomb, they are going to have a hard time getting me to say anything about it."
It's not really clear at this point why he'd doubt the story. By all official accounts, he had no reason to mistrust the military's explanation.
Regardless of Brazel's take, I'm sure everyone in town had their own theories on the events.
No, actually not. This was the end of anyone discussing the Roswell incident. Brazel let the matter rest, and Ramey's press conference put out the fire before it even really started going. And that's the last we heard about it for years.
Over the next couple of decades, there were reams upon reams of official UFO research done by the military. Between Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book, the Air Force extensively cataloged UFO sightings from 1948 to 1969. There were 12,618 UFO sightings compiled in those reports.
Roswell isn't one of them. After July 1947, there are 0 written mentions of the Roswell incident until 1978 regarding UFOs or otherwise, until one of our nation's finest institutions came forward with the scoop to end all scoops. The National Enquirer was the first to connect UFOs with the Roswell incident.
Well, that's complicated. While the Enquirer has done their fair share of Roswell stories over the years, to claim that they're the first people to report it isn't entirely true. It's a talking point used by the Air Force to discredit the pro-UFO crowd.
They say that the first people to mention it were the reporters and editors of the Enquirer, and it makes it sound like garbage news. However, to say that they were the first isn't really accurate. It's more of a debate tactic.
What is true is that a reporter for the Enquirer, Bob Pratt, was one of the first people to conduct interviews about the incident in the late 70s. But the real people to focus on are Stanton Friedman, William Moore, and Charles Berlitz, Carl Flock, Kevin D. Randall, and Donald Schmidt, all of whom were active around 1978 onwards interviewing people about Roswell.
That seems like a really specific date. It makes you wonder why it took that long for people to start talking about the UFOs.
That's a good question, and the answer, like in most good conspiracy theories, is that it was a coincidence. The first person we should pay attention to is Stanton Friedman, who to this day is one of the foremost UFO researchers, in addition to being a nuclear physicist. Friedman was talking about extraterrestrial life visiting Earth back in the 60s. In 1978, someone who was aware of his background as a ufologist told Friedman he knew a guy who'd handled UFO wreckage.
Re-enter Major Jesse Marcel, one of the two Air Force men to transport the wreckage from Mac Brazel's ranch. Apparently, Marcel had insisted from the jump that the wreckage was alien in origin, no matter what his superiors told him, and he'd held on to this belief for decades, telling anyone that would listen. We'll be getting into a lot more detail regarding Marcel's interviews and credibility as a witness in Part 2, but Friedman's exposure of Marcel's claims was what jump-started Roswell as a hotspot for ufologists and alien conspiracies.
From there, interviews were conducted with as many witnesses as the ufologists could find. However, Mac Brazel died in 1963, General Ramey died in the same year, and Colonel Blanchard died in 1966. Most of the primary witnesses had passed away by the time the conspiracy theory started, and as we mentioned earlier, for whatever reason, Marcel's partner, Sheridan Cavett, wasn't a focus of the ufologists during their first frenzy of research.
Marcel was their star witness, but the UFO researchers were pushing more and more conspiracy theories, linking in other witnesses of varying veracity. The idea of the wreckage being a mere weather balloon had begun to evaporate in the public consciousness.
Jesse Marcel died in 1986, but by then his version of events had permeated every corner of ufology, and his son had picked up the torch.
The other major inflection point in the incident's public perception came from an episode of the show Unsolved Mysteries in 1989. In addition to some pretty cool reenactments, the episode added a few more witnesses to the mix, including Glenn Dennis, a mortician's assistant at the time, who claimed he received a call from the Roswell Air Base asking what size coffins they had and if they had anything that could fit a child.
Spooky. Remember what you said about aliens having to be pretty small to fit in the wreckage, maybe even child-sized?
With the hubbub rising, books getting published, and the newfound UFO talk around Roswell, the government took a pretty drastic measure to curb the hysteria.
In 1994, the U.S. government admitted that there was a cover-up in Roswell, and that the story that General Ramey gave about the weather balloons wasn't the whole truth. Coming up, we'll answer the question, if it wasn't a weather balloon, what was it? Molly and I have some exciting news for you. Starting now, you can listen to Conspiracy Theories episodes that are older than 6 months completely ad-free, exclusively on Stitcher Premium.
We're always looking for ways to improve the listener experience. We found an amazing partner in Stitcher to bring you episodes ad-free 6 months after they're released.
Again, this will only affect episodes older than 6 months. Nothing else will change. We'll still be releasing new Conspiracy Theories episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.
For a free month trial, go to StitcherPremium.com/Parcast and use promo code Parcast. That's StitcherPremium.com/Parcast and use promo code Parcast. Now, back to the story.
By the 90s, various theories about the Roswell incident and its ties to possible alien activity had entered the public consciousness. The government was bombarded with constant Freedom of Information acts, and questions continued to be raised about what was really in the wreckage. Finally, someone who had the resources to do some digging decided to get to the bottom of what really happened at Roswell in 1947.
Enter Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico. Schiff was elected to the House of Representatives in 1989 and soon became a part of the House Government Operations Committee, which oversees the General Accounting Office, or GAO. The GAO is kind of like Congress's version of Internal Affairs. They're the branch of Congress in charge of investigating the government itself.
Now, it's not clear what Schiff's interest in the Roswell case was. Being from New Mexico, he may have had a personal interest in the case and wanted to unpack it for himself.
Or maybe he just wanted his constituents to stop bugging him about it. Either way, in 1993, he decided to call up the Department of Defense and ask for a briefing on whatever information about the incident they had. Their response was underwhelming.
Schiff received a call back from the DoD, who told him to take it up with the National Archives. While it's not clear if the DoD was just not in the mood to help or if there was something more sinister at work, Schiff's conclusion was that he was being stonewalled. He checked in with the archives, and despite their extensive cataloging of UFO sightings in the aforementioned Project Blue Book, they found nothing on Roswell.
From there, according to an article in the LA Times, Schiff said, quote, "I was getting pretty upset at all the running around. Generally, I'm a skeptic on UFOs and alien beings, but there are indications from the runaround that I got that whatever it wasn't a balloon. Apparently, it's another government cover-up."
While venting about the bureaucratic quagmire he'd gotten himself in, his contacts at the GAO offered to step in and see what they could find. The GAO sent a memo to the DoD, warning them about an impending investigation into whether the proper procedures were followed in regards to the Roswell records.
Fast forward a few months to July 1994, when the Air Force released a document titled Report of Air Force Research Regarding the Roswell Incident.
This report was generated in the middle of Schiff's GAO investigation, which was still in progress when the document was released. It's difficult to tell whether the timeline is a coincidence or if their motives were more defensive. Here's what we have, now leave us alone.
On page 16 of the report, the government lets us in on what the Roswell wreckage really was. It was a balloon, but not for any routine weather observation.
Cutting through the jargon, the basics are that the government was launching balloons to monitor sound waves coming from Soviet territory in order to determine if they were conducting nuclear tests. The project was codenamed Project Mogul.
According to the report, quote, Project Mogul was a then-sensitive, classified project whose purpose was to determine the state of Soviet nuclear weapons research. Because the Soviet Union's borders were closed, the U.S. government sought to develop a long-range nuclear explosion detection capability. Long-range, balloon-borne, low-frequency acoustic detection was posed as a potential solution, end quote.
So there's the Air Force version of admitting a cover-up. The Roswell wreckage was a balloon from Project Mogul. Since it was a top-secret project, they couldn't go into further detail about it at the time. That's why there was confusion at the Roswell base in the first place. The project would have been above the security clearance of anyone stationed at Roswell.
Remember Sheridan Cavett, the other Air Force officer with Marcel who recovered the wreckage? The Air Force tracked him down and interviewed him as the last living witness who handled the wreckage firsthand. From the report, Cavett related that he had been contacted on numerous occasions by UFO researchers. However, he felt that he had oftentimes been misrepresented or had his comments taken out of context. He thought at the time, and continues to do so today, that what he found was a weather balloon.
Pretty conclusive stuff. the only living eyewitness, maintained that he never thought the wreckage was a UFO.
The report dealt with the rest of the theories thoroughly and sarcastically. You get the feeling that Colonel Weaver and his research team took great satisfaction in finally getting to refute the ufologists.
A particularly fun passage reads, quote, "Pro-UFO persons who obtain a copy of this report at this point most probably begin the cover-up is still on claims. Nevertheless, the research indicated absolutely no evidence of any kind that a spaceship crashed near Roswell or that any alien occupants were recovered therefrom in some secret military operation or otherwise."
It gets even blunter. After the Roswell incident, quote, "there were no indications and warnings that would be logically generated if an alien craft entered U.S. territory. To believe that such high-level security activity could be conducted without creating any records certainly stretches the imagination of those who have served in the military, who know that paperwork of some kind is necessary to accomplish even emergency, highly classified, or sensitive tasks. In short, the military lives and dies on paperwork, and it's pretty unlikely that nobody has found any official documents regarding an alien event."
The report also implies that the military does have an idea of what a cover-up would have to entail, sort of an O.J. Simpson style "if I did it" protest. If there was an actual alien cover-up, quote, "the military would have had to order thousands of soldiers and airmen, not only at Roswell, but throughout the U.S., to act nonchalantly, pretend to conduct and report business as usual, and generate absolutely no paperwork of a suspicious nature. The records indicate that none of this happened, or if it did, it was controlled by a security system so efficient and tight that no one, U.S. or otherwise, has been able to duplicate it since."
That's right. One of the military's key refutations of a cover-up is that they wouldn't be competent enough to pull it off. The report also refutes a few other theories about the Roswell crash, that the wreckage wasn't an airplane crash, a missile crash, or a nuclear accident.
All that being said, this report came from the same body that lied about the wreckage being a weather balloon for nearly 50 years. It makes me wonder whether this is all part of a continued cover-up.
It certainly could be, but they do draw attention to that possibility within the report. In short, it summarizes one of the theories that the Air Force imposed security oaths and death threats on anyone who came forward with knowledge about UFOs. That theory, of course, ignores that hundreds of people have come forward with those claims, and none of them have ended up in shallow graves.
Well, that's a fair point. It even goes back to that original interview Mac Brazel did the day after the news story ran, where he actively pushes back on the Air Force's original weather balloon claims, apparently without consequence.
Never mind how Major Jesse Marcel managed to be the poster boy for an alien cover-up conspiracy for almost a decade without anyone in the government shutting him up. But the report's researchers took another step to make sure any witnesses they spoke to were honest. Quote, "In order to counter possible future arguments that the persons interviewed were still covering up material because of prior security oaths, the interviewees were provided with authorization that would officially allow discussion of classified information if applicable, or free them from any prior restriction in discussing the matter if such existed."
Sheridan Cavett, in particular, is noted as being someone who was cleared of any hypothetical security oath. There's a transcript attached to the report of his interview where he says, quote, "I was not sworn into any secrecy ever about any of this stuff. I never heard anyone say, don't talk about this and it's hot stuff. I think Marcel would have told me something."
Before we wrap up with the report, I want to point out one more instance of the Air Force appearing actively annoyed at the ufologists. When they go over their research methodology, they mention most of the prominent researchers that we talked about during the rise of ufology in the late 70s.
From the report, quote, "Many of these claims appear to be hearsay, undocumented, taken out of context, self-serving, or otherwise dubious. Additionally, many of the above authors are not even in agreement over the dates of the alleged incident, the exact locations of the purported debris, and the extent of the wreckage."
That may be the understatement of the century. As we'll see next week, conspiracy theorists are all over the map when it comes to the most basic details of the Roswell incident.
There's also pretty pointed criticism of the ufologist methods in the report. As an example, one of the books from a UFO researcher mentioned 11 military men that were stationed in Roswell and claimed that the DoD had no record of these men ever existing.
The Air Force, after a cursory check, immediately found 8 of the names. They had substantial documentation of their military service, and they were indeed stationed in Roswell. The other 3 names were so common that it was impossible to tell which ones the ufologist was referring to.
To add insult to injury, the report pointed out that the ufologist in question claimed to have interviewed one of these missing men in 1990, despite his record showing that he died in 1951, which is a pretty neat trick.
Okay, Air Force, we get it. The other thing we want to mention about the report is that it's long. The original version released by Weaver was about 25 pages, but a supplemental report about the mechanics of Project Mogul balloons, along with attached materials, brings the report up to a staggering 1,000 pages.
The combined reports, entitled The Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert, are available online for free if you want to check them out. And based on the tone and the sheer size of the thing, you get the impression that this was intended to be the final nail in the coffin of conspiracy theories.
But although this is the end of the official version of events, if there's one thing conspiracy theorists don't like, it's being told to shut up.
While we've established the official story here, there are mountains of unofficial versions and theories. There are discussions about the materials of the wreckage, multiple crash sites, and witnesses upon witnesses upon witnesses.
There are even theories about alien bodies being recovered.
And most shocking of all, claims about live aliens being taken into custody.
Next week, we'll examine 3 main conspiracy theories.
For conspiracy theory number 1, we'll dive back into the life of Jesse Marcel, the key player in the original theories about extraterrestrials crashing in Roswell. He claims that the wreckage he found was definitely extraterrestrial in origin and that nefarious forces in the military covered up his findings from day one.
For conspiracy theory number 2, we'll look into the oft-rumored second crash sites where live aliens were allegedly found and taken into military custody.
And conspiracy theory number 3, we'll discuss the explosive claims made by Glenn Dennis, the mortician's assistant, who said he was asked for coffins to fit alien bodies, and whose main connection with the incident died in a plane crash before getting to tell her side of the story.
And as a bonus, we'll look at the culture of the ufologists themselves, the infighting and refutations that have led to so much confusion over the story.
While the official story has its share of twists and turns, next episode is where we're going to get into the weeds. We'll find out just exactly how far the Roswell theories have sprawled and do our best to untangle one of the tightest webs of conspiracies out there.
When it comes to the events in Roswell, New Mexico in July of 1947, the truth is buried under a mountain of contradictory accounts and unreliable memories. Eyewitnesses can't agree on whether the debris they found in the desert was made of metal or wood. The few remaining photographs are accused of being staged. Even the official story was later revealed to be a cover-up.
When even the basic facts are under contention, who do you believe? Are eyewitnesses reliable, or are their human memories too faulty? Can we trust the U.S. military even after they admitted to covering up the truth in 1947?
Even if the witnesses are recalling the facts correctly, how can they ever prove it without physical evidence?
And if the wreckage in Roswell wasn't actually an Air Force surveillance balloon, what was it?
There are hundreds of conspiracy theories surrounding the crash in Roswell. This week, we'll look at 3 of the most popular.
Conspiracy theory number 1, the wreckage found in Roswell was extraterrestrial.
Conspiracy theory number 2, not only was the crash extraterrestrial, there were actual alien bodies recovered from the crash site and examined by Air Force doctors.
And conspiracy theory number 3, there was a second, much more revealing crash that happened near Roswell around the same time. The minor wreckage found on Mac Brazel's farm was used as a distraction, while the military covered up the more significant crash.
The scope of the conspiracies surrounding Roswell is a little surprising, since the official story is pretty straightforward. A rancher found some odd debris. The military picked up the wreckage, initially called it a flying saucer, and then, after further examination, declared it was actually a weather balloon. Decades later, it came to light that the weather balloon was actually from a secret Air Force program called Project Mogul, and the truth had been covered up to protect the classified project.
But the devil is in the details. Out of the fairly small pool of primary witnesses who saw the wreckage, only a few were still alive in 1978 when ufologists first turned their attention to Roswell. But those surviving witnesses have all given different and contradictory versions of what happened, some more sensational than others. It's hard to know who to believe.
Which brings us to our first theory. Major Jesse Marcel, one of the first witnesses to handle the wreckage, believed that the Roswell wreckage wasn't a weather balloon, but was, in fact, a craft from out of this world.
Marcel was an intelligence officer for the Air Force's 509th Bomb Wing Group, the only flight group in the world who knew how to drop an atomic bomb. A pretty prestigious position. As we covered last week, he was called to Mac Brazel's ranch outside Roswell to scope out some strange wreckage.
Marcel's commanding officer, Colonel Blanchard, ordered him to take a counterintelligence officer with him. There would have been concerns that the wreckage was Soviet.
So Marcel and counterintelligence officer Sheridan Cavett took a trip to Mac Brazel's ranch. When they saw the wreckage, Cavett didn't find it very interesting, but according to Marcel, what they saw was completely unnatural.
By Marcel's own vivid description, quote, "I'd never seen anything like it. I didn't know what we were picking up. I still don't know. As of this day, I still don't know what it was."
Remember, Marcel was a military man with years of experience in the Air Force, and he couldn't even begin to identify what he was looking at.
Which does sort of gel with the facts. The wreckage was part of the top-secret Project Mogul, which Marcel and other soldiers at the Roswell base wouldn't have been privy to.
Of course, Marcel had died by the time the government admitted to Project Mogul's existence, making it pretty hard for him to refute their story once it came out. For what it's worth, the Mogul balloon would have essentially looked like a regular weather balloon anyway. So if what Marcel saw didn't look like a weather or surveillance balloon, what was it?
The rancher, Mac Brazel, remembers the material as mostly wood and foil. The photos we've seen of the wreckage all look about like that. And Marcel himself even agreed some of the material looks like wood.
But looks can be deceiving. According to Marcel, before they took the wreckage back to the base, his curiosity got the better of him, and he started playing scientist with the mysterious wood-like material. He took out a cigarette lighter and tried to set the wreckage on fire, but it wouldn't burn. He hit the foil with a sledgehammer, and it immediately reformed back to its original shape. It was completely indestructible.
Well, hang on. An intelligence officer, someone whose entire job was ensuring information was properly handled, decided to set a mysterious, possibly Soviet craft on fire and hit it with a sledgehammer.
He was trained in intelligence, not forensic procedure?
Sure. According to Cavett, who was there the entire time, he never saw Marcel conduct these experiments.
From there, Marcel's story converges back with the established version. He and Cavett collected the wreckage and took it back to the base, riding in different vehicles. Although, according to Marcel, this wasn't all they did.
Marcel was apparently so taken with this wreckage that he decided he had to show someone. It was late at night by the time they'd left the ranch, but Marcel swung by his house, woke his wife and son, and spread out the wreckage on their kitchen floor.
Now, the only proof we have of this is the word of Marcel's wife, Viad, and his 11-year-old son, Jesse Jr. However, they've sworn up and down they saw the wreckage. Jesse Jr. said the debris was, quote, a thick foil-like metallic gray substance, a brittle brownish-black plastic-like material like bakelite, and fragments of what appeared to be I-beams embossed with pink or purplish-pink characters.
What's interesting is that Major Marcel disagreed with his son about that. Both Marcels have sketched out their memories of what the wreckage looked like, and their depictions don't match up at all.
Either way, Marcel eventually gathered up the wreckage and took it back to base.
He showed it to Colonel Blanchard, the press release came out, and then the next morning he flew with the wreckage to Wright-Patterson, as per the official story.
Irving Newton, the officer who confirmed that the wreckage was a weather balloon, recalled, quote, "While I was examining the debris, Major Marcel was picking up pieces of the target sticks and trying to convince me that some of the notations were alien writings. He did not convince me."
The photographs of the wreckage taken at the base don't really match with Marcel's descriptions. He addresses this by saying that they took one picture of him holding some of the less interesting debris. After that, his superiors cleared out the real wreckage and replaced it with other debris that looked more like a weather balloon. They photographed that wreckage more extensively.
That raises a lot of questions. Why allow a photo of the real wreckage at all? Why did they have their own wreckage handy on such short notice? There would have been a photographer there. Did they remember any sort of odd behavior?
As a matter of fact, the photographer, J. Bond Johnson, does remember some odd behavior. He founded a group called the Roswell Photo Interpretation Team, which exists solely to get to the truth of the photos he took in 1947. He claims that the wreckage he photographed wasn't from a weather balloon or from any sort of monitoring balloon from Project Mogul. Johnson claims he asked Ramey what the wreckage was, and he said, quote, "How the hell should I know?" On the implication being that if the wreckage was a weather balloon, Ramey should have been able to identify it.
Which is all well and good, but that itself creates more problems. Johnson wasn't even contacted by ufologists until 1989. When he was originally interviewed, he said Ramey briefed him on the wreckage being a weather balloon. It wasn't until years later that he began to change his tune.
Either way, after Ramey issued his official statement that the wreckage was a weather balloon, he told Marcel, quote, "You leave the wreckage right here, we'll take care of it from here." Was that Ramey telling Marcel that they'll handle the press and the explanation? Or is there something more sinister behind his words?
It's tough to tell. These are the basics of Jesse Marcel's claims, though. The wreckage he found was more than a weather or a military balloon, and it had some odd, possibly extraterrestrial properties. When he brought it to the higher-ups, they told him to look the other way.
Every Roswell conspiracy theory stems from these claims. Marcel was the first person to imply publicly that the Roswell wreckage was anything but a weather balloon when he was approached by ufologists in 1978.
There are a few questions raised here. First of all, it took over 30 years for Marcel's story to come out.
Second, when he was first interviewed by ufologists Friedman and Stringfield, he couldn't even remember the year of the event, nor did he have any sort of documentation to back up his claims.
According to Stringfield, Marcel never even mentioned aliens until the researchers suggested the idea to him.
If that's the case, then why did Marcel keep showing up as a witness? If Friedman knew he had planted the idea of alien involvement in his head, why bother to keep interviewing him?
Maybe Friedman figured something was better than nothing. Either way, the real breakout moment was when reporter Bob Pratt interviewed Marcel for the National Enquirer later in 1978. It was eyewitness testimony from a supposedly credible witness.
Unfortunately, the Pratt interview was also the seed of Marcel's downfall. While he continued to be a voice in the ufologist community until his death in 1986, his testimony prompted some researchers to dig deeper into his statements.
Not his statements about the wreckage, though. His statements about himself.
Well, Marcel claimed to have been a pilot since 1928. He said he was awarded 5 medals for his service as a pilot in World War II and had a degree in physics from George Washington University. After Roswell, he wrote a report about the Soviets' first nuclear detonation, which President Truman himself read on air.
Hugely impressive stuff. Regrettably, most of it isn't true. Marcel claimed to have been a pilot since 1928, but his application to the Air Force in 1942 mentions absolutely no prior flying experience. His records show that he was awarded 2 service medals, not 5. Not only did he not get a degree from George Washington University, but there are no records of him ever attending the college. He may very well have written the report recording the first Soviet nuclear detonation, but Truman didn't read it on air because there was no radio broadcast of the news at all.
There's one other factor we should mention here. A line in Marcel's performance review during his time at Roswell between July 1947 and April 1948. His only known weakness was an inclination to magnify problems he is confronted with.
This brings us to the crux of the problem regarding Jesse Marcel's testimony. He's an embellisher and an exaggerator. Maybe he misremembered his story by the time Friedman and Company found him in 1978, or maybe he's always had a talent for exaggeration. The question is, does it matter?
For what it's worth, Marcel stood by his story until his death, as did his son. The evidence is pretty limited, so we have to decide which witnesses to trust. How plausible is it that the wreckage he found was extraterrestrial?
This is a tough one, but I'm going to rate it a 3 out of 10. I don't think he was out to hoax anyone, but I'm willing to believe that there are some aspects of the wreckage he didn't recognize, and he jumped to a few conclusions. He stuck to his story for years, but he never provided any evidence to support his claim that the wreckage came from an alien spaceship.
I agree with you. Marcel doesn't seem to have an agenda, but he also doesn't have any proof. But what about other witnesses?
Up next, we'll look at another eyewitness who has his own version of what happened at Roswell.
While Jesse Marcel's testimony was the spark that brought the Roswell incident into the public eye, the incident didn't truly catch fire until two men got involved in 1989. One of them was Robert Stack, the host of Unsolved Mysteries.
The Unsolved Mysteries episode on Roswell proposed a second conspiracy theory. There were actual alien bodies found in the wreckage that were covered up by the government.
It's worth noting here that Unsolved Mysteries wasn't exactly a paragon of documentary filmmaking, although some of its episodes did lead to the mysteries being, well, solved. At the end of the episode on Roswell, viewers were encouraged to call in with any information they might have. One call stood out from the rest, from a man named Glenn Dennis.
Dennis claimed that a friend of his who worked on the base as a nurse told him there were bodies in the wreckage that didn't look human. Dennis said he saw the wreckage with his own eyes, and he was threatened into silence by military officials. After the incident, the nurse was suddenly transferred overseas, and a few weeks later, Dennis was told she was dead.
Dennis's story is probably the closest in tone to what we think of when we think of Roswell conspiracies. Alien bodies, shadowy military threats, and mysterious disappearances. Let's look at his story in detail.
On July 8, 1947, a few hours after the original press release announced that the Air Force had found a flying disc in Roswell, a young Glenn Dennis got a call from the Roswell Air Base. Dennis was working as a hearse and ambulance driver for the local funeral home, which had a contract with the base to provide ambulance services.
The officer peppered him with questions. How would you preserve bodies that were left outside for a few days before they were collected? Do you have hermetically sealed caskets? How small are they? What's the smallest you have?
Dennis answered as best he could and offered to come down to the base to help out, but the officer deflected. He said he was just preparing in case it came up in the future. Obviously, Dennis found this pretty weird.
As luck would have it, not long after that, a soldier was injured in a motorcycle accident, and Dennis's work as an ambulance driver brought him onto the base.
While he was there, Dennis noticed some suspicious stuff in the back of a couple of military ambulances. He recalled, quote, "There were several pieces which looked like the bottom of a canoe, about 3 feet in length. It resembled stainless steel with a purple hue. There was some strange-looking writing on the material resembling Egyptian hieroglyphics." That sounds pretty similar to Jesse Marcel's description, doesn't it?
It does. Marcel's account of the wreckage was described in detail in the Unsolved Mysteries episode Dennis had watched immediately before calling Unsolved Mysteries and telling his own story. That may be where he got the idea.
But other than the hieroglyphics in purple hue, this description is very different from any of the other documented descriptions of the wreckage, which could potentially mean the wreckage was from a different crash, or that Marcel only found part of the wreckage on Brazel's ranch and the Army hauled more in afterward.
Maybe. Either way, Dennis dropped off the soldier and then decided to find his friend on the base, a nurse. As he was wandering around, she ran out of an examination room holding a cloth over her mouth.
She told him, quote, "Get out of here or you're going to be in a lot of trouble." Before Dennis could ask what was going on, she rushed away. An Army captain noticed Dennis and immediately had him escorted out of the base.
Before they could take him back to the funeral home, Dennis and his escorts were stopped by another officer, a red-headed man with, quote, the meanest-looking eyes Dennis had ever seen. He said, "You did not see anything. There was no crash here, and if you say anything, you could get in a lot of trouble."
If that wasn't clear enough, the next day, Sheriff Wilcox got in touch with Dennis's father and Dennis himself. He told them the military wanted Dennis's name, his address, and the names of his family.
Apparently, Dennis didn't take that too seriously because he spent the rest of the morning trying to reach the nurse from the base. Finally, she got a hold of him and they met at the officers' club on the base, apparently with no resistance from the military.
The nurse told Dennis everything she saw. She helped 2 doctors, who she'd never seen before, perform autopsies on 3 strange and mangled bodies. The bodies had been left out in the elements and chewed on by wild animals. They smelled awful.
To back up her description, she pulled out a prescription pad and drew pictures of the bodies. Dennis recalled, quote, "The eyes were deeply set, the skulls were flexible, the nose was concave. The doctor said there was heavy cartilage instead of teeth."
She gave these pictures to Dennis and left to continue her shift. He never saw her again.
The next time Dennis tried to contact her, he was told she had been transferred. Sure enough, he received a postcard a couple weeks later telling Dennis that she was now overseas.
When he replied, the letter was returned, marked, quote, "Return to sender, deceased." After following up, he was told that she died in a mysterious plane crash.
That's the end of Dennis's version of events. For years, Dennis was considered one of the key witnesses in ufologist research, but there was one question he couldn't answer. What was the nurse's name?
When asked about the identity of the nurse in 1989, Dennis gave the name Naomi Self with 1 F. After 6 years of searching, they found a yearbook of Roswell base employees. Naomi Self wasn't listed in the book as a nurse or otherwise.
On top of that, one of the nurses who did work there in 1947 had no recollection of a Naomi Self, despite remembering all the nurses listed in the yearbook.
At some point during the search, Dennis told one researcher, Carl Flock, that the name should be Self with 2 Fs. He also gave out her middle name, Maria. According to Flock, Dennis didn't trust the other researchers, which is why he'd never corrected himself until now.
That rationale raises a lot of questions on its own. First off, Self 1F and Self double F are essentially the same name.
It's a moot point anyway, as there was no luck finding a Naomi Maria Self, single or double F. Nobody of that name ever worked in Roswell, or even in the entire military at the time.
When Dennis was presented with the results, or lack thereof, he was unsurprised. His explanation? Naomi Self wasn't her real name. He decided to lie to every single researcher and protect her true name for himself.
Sure, that's logical.
When pressed, he only gave one researcher the first letter of her real last name. He said, "If I ever got proof she was dead, I probably would make her name known or confirm it."
At this point, it's hard to tell if there ever was a nurse at all.
There was a Catholic nurse who worked at the base at the time, a Lieutenant Eileen M. Fanton. While this isn't anywhere close to a name that Dennis gave, she resembles the physical descriptions that Dennis provided. She served overseas and left the base shortly after the Roswell incident due to a medical condition.
Since her departure was related to a medical issue, even if the Roswell airfield was contacted about her whereabouts, they wouldn't be able to give out any information due to medical confidentiality. The last record we have of Eileen Fanton is from 1955, apparently not dead from a plane crash.
Another issue is, despite the best efforts of ufologists, there are absolutely no documents of whatever plane crash the nurse would have died in, and no report of any Air Force nurses dying in a plane crash during that period.
The Air Force employee who told Dennis the news could have been mistaken about what happened, or the entire crash could have been a cover story.
After Dennis found out there was no record of a plane crash, he floated an alternative theory that the military had actually organized for the nurse to join a convent and become a nun.
It would make sense that the military would spirit her away somewhere. She'd be the ultimate smoking gun, a military employee who had seen alien bodies.
This story seems awfully convenient.
What's equally convenient is that Dennis claims he first saw the wreckage at the airbase on the night of July 8th, but he also claims he saw the front page headline about the Roswell flying disc, which was published on July 8th, after he went to see the nurse for the second time. That would put his trip to the airbase on July 7th, the same day Mac Brazel alerted the Army to the wreckage in the first place. The timeline doesn't add up.
While there are certainly timeline discrepancies, we do know Dennis at least has the drawings supposedly given to him by the nurse. He showed them to several researchers in person.
Not quite. According to Dennis, when he left the funeral home in 1962, he left the original drawings behind. Any drawings we've seen were drawn from memory by Dennis himself.
Though, according to Dennis's neighbor, an artist named Walter Henn, that isn't true either. Henn said that Dennis approached him and asked him to draft the sketches, saying, "We could make a lot of money out of this."
Okay, I think I'm beginning to see a pattern here. Dennis doesn't seem like a very credible witness. But there's one thing we need to talk about before we render our verdict. There was a horrible plane crash at the Roswell Air Base in 1956.
A plane's fuel tank exploded and burned the bodies of the crew. The corpses, according to the autopsies, had suffered severe burns and completely lost their legs, making them about 4 feet tall. The skulls were fractured to the point where they were almost malleable, and their faces were almost completely missing. There was also a serious odor coming from the bodies, almost overpowering.
I am assuming these autopsies were conducted at the same funeral home that Dennis worked in.
They were indeed. While the bodies were human, they were so deformed by the burns that they perfectly matched the descriptions of the so-called alien bodies that the nurse gave to Dennis. According to ufologist Carl Flock, when he shows copies of the drawings Dennis made to experienced air investigators, they usually ask what air crash they were from.
So it's likely that Dennis would have seen the human bodies from this crash, and they lodged themselves in his memory. Consciously or not, when he commissioned the drawings of the alien bodies, that memory resurfaced.
I think I'm ready to rate the plausibility of this theory. 0. Dennis's story changed multiple times and in multiple ways. The fake drawings were clearly pulled from his experiences as a funeral home worker. His timeline of events also doesn't track with any other accounts.
I'll second that. While something extraterrestrial may have crashed at Roswell, this account of alien bodies doesn't hold water.
All the theories we've been examining have, in one way or another, been directly related to the official version of the story. And conspiracy theorists don't usually trust official stories. But our final theory is a completely unofficial version of events, where the real crash happened miles away from Mac Brazel's ranch.
Up next, we'll get into that theory and the masterminds behind it. We've noticed a certain evolution in conspiracy theories about Roswell. While the original theories from Jesse Marcel hold pretty closely to the official story, the further we go forward, the more elaborate and sensational they become.
Unsolved Mysteries and Glenn Dennis both talk about actual alien bodies. Dennis's tale of the disappearing nurse has a dime store thriller quality to it, but in the 1990s, a new theory ratcheted the intensity up even higher. that there was an entirely different crash site with a relatively intact alien craft and multiple alien bodies. The smaller crash on Mac Brazel's ranch was used as a distraction to keep prying eyes away from the real crash.
The book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell by Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt, opens with a scene straight out of a sci-fi blockbuster. Military radar picked up a strange object in the sky on July 1st, 1947, a week before the wreckage was retrieved from Mac Brazel's ranch.
The object on radar disappeared and reappeared over the next 4 days. On July 4th, the radar scopes were flooded with a blinding light. It looked as if the object had exploded and then dropped off the radar.
While the military was glued to their scopes, an eyewitness saw the crash with his own eyes. A good 30 miles from Mac Brazel's ranch, Jim Ragsdale, a surveyor for El Paso Natural Gas, was spending a quiet night outside with his lover, the fantastically named Trudy Truelove.
Well, they were lying in the back of Ragsdale's pickup, buck naked, to quote him, when they saw the crash. Ragsdale and Truelove headed over to where the object fell.
According to Ragsdale, what they found was similar to the official description of the debris at Brazel's ranch. Truelove was scared by the wreckage. Ragsdale tried to take some for himself, but Truelove stopped him. Before they could do much more, the military quickly cleared and secured the area.
The wreckage was shaped almost like a wing, 30 feet long, embedded into a dry creek bed.
This sounds like a metal fuselage, close to what we think of when we picture an aircraft crash. It was mostly intact, too, not spread out over a wide area like the Brazel Ranch wreckage.
The 5 bodies in and around the crash were the real focus of attention. They were 5 feet tall, with silver flight suits and very pale skin, resembling, and I quote Schmidt and Randall's book here, Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Obviously, they only came to that comparison in the 1990s, as we don't have any testimony from this crash prior to that.
At any rate, during the recovery, military men were rotated in and out of the site, making sure that nobody spent too much time there at once. They didn't want anyone to get a clear picture of the thing.
The bodies were wrapped in lead-lined body bags and stored in a hangar on the Air Force Base, with a circle of guards ordered to shoot anyone who wasn't supposed to be there.
Around this time, the bodies were moved for medical examination. This was on July 5th, which, according to Schmidt and Randall, was when Mac Brazel would have actually arrived in Roswell to report the wreckage he uncovered 30 miles away and with a decidedly different appearance.
According to this theory, the military was concerned about the public discovering the bodies they'd uncovered. That's when someone got the bright idea to use Mac Brazel's wreckage as a distraction.
They could claim that they uncovered a flying disc on Brazel's ranch. Then, while everyone was paying attention to that, they could handle the actual wreckage from the other crash site.
That more or less brings us back into line with the official story. The press release goes out. The wreckage from Mac Brazel's ranch is transported to Fort Worth, and hours later, General Ramey claims it's a weather balloon.
The military does whatever it does with the bodies and the real wreckage, and the public is none the wiser. Cover-up completed.
What we need to look at are the witnesses. Let's start with Jim Ragsdale, who claimed to have found the wreckage and bodies on the night of July 4th.
Ragsdale didn't even come forward until 1993, 46 years after the incident. While his original story appeared in Schmidt and Randall's book, he added some pretty incredible details after the fact. He actually did keep some of the wreckage and showed it off at a local tavern a few years later.
Shortly after that, his car, trailer, and house were broken into, and the wreckage was stolen.
Convenient.
There's also the question of Trudy Truelove, the other primary witness. According to Ragsdale, she was killed in a car crash not long after they showed the wreckage off at the tavern. Some of the wreckage she'd kept in her car mysteriously disappeared when the car was recovered.
I thought that Truelove was scared by the wreckage. Why would she keep any of it?
Good question. Maybe she came around.
The holes keep piling up. Ragsdale lived in Carlsbad, New Mexico at the time, a good 80 miles away from where he supposedly saw the crash. He claims he was in the area working as a surveyor for a pipeline, but when the El Paso Natural Gas Company was contacted for confirmation, they said there were not even any plans for that pipeline until 1952.
Between 1993 and 1995, Ragsdale changed the location of his tryst with Trudy Truelove over and over, often with 70 miles of difference. Even I'll admit there's just too much mess here for it to be treated credibly.
Most researchers have since written off Ragsdale as a source. There doesn't seem to have been much of an effort to verify that Trudy Truelove was even real either.
So we'll cross that off the list, but there were also sources on the Air Force side, which is where we get most of the more extreme details in Schmidt and Randall's books. There are numerous Air Force officials cited. Some are anonymous, going by names like Mr. X. A few other names come up, like Joseph Osborne and Steve McKenzie. Some just get credited by their job title, like an intelligence operative. The problem is that every single pseudonym traces back to one man, Frank Kaufman.
In 1947, Kaufman was a clerk for the personnel office at the Roswell airfield. As a civilian, yet he was supposedly present for all of these incredibly secret events.
But Kaufman wasn't really a personnel clerk, according to him. He was part of a special team, sort of a proto-SEAL Team 6, or maybe more of an early Men in Black. He refers to them as the Nine, and they are the stuff every conspiracy theorist dreams of. A deep cover black ops group that doesn't even answer to the president.
Kaufman claims he was first called up by a general to monitor the blips on the radar, even though he was not a trained radar technician.
When the object crashed and the military headed out to retrieve it, Kaufman went with them. He was there when they recovered and transported the alien bodies, and he saw the guards surrounding them in the hangar.
Later, he claims he saw Blanchard write the press release confirming that the wreckage from Brazel's ranch was a flying saucer. Blanchard personally writing the press release directly contradicts almost every other testimony. In fact, almost all of Kaufman's testimony is contradictory to the rest of the witnesses.
But he's supposedly a secret agent, which certainly helps his credibility.
For someone in such a sensitive and classified position, Kaufman does talk very freely about his work with the Nine. He even has photos of the Nine together, which he frequently shows to researchers.
He also has a series of high-level documents, like a top-secret report he wrote up on the Roswell incident. However, he only shows researchers a photocopy of the report that he made at the time he wrote it in 1947.
After Kaufman's death in 2001, researchers finally got a good look at the photocopied documents he'd been showing them, along with the original documents he used to make them. They were all forgeries.
Like Ragsdale, even the hardcore researchers have written off Kaufman as a storyteller. His story is wildly divergent from any evidence, and what proof he did have was exposed as a forgery after his death. The plausibility of the second crash site, as reported by Jim Ragsdale and Frank Kaufman, is a big fat zero.
There are literally hundreds of other witnesses with their own version of the Roswell events, but we've covered some of the biggest ones. To me, though, the official version is still the story that holds the most water.
Jesse Marcel is the only eyewitness ufologists have found who was actually, definitively at the scene of the Roswell crash. He stuck to his story for years, but his credibility is an issue, and he completely lacks evidence for his more outlandish claims of alien involvement.
This is also a rare conspiracy theory case where the government has actually admitted to a cover-up. The evidence has been poured over again and again, and the book should have been completely shut, but researchers keep finding ways to open it.
Maybe there is a smoking gun that we've yet to find. Maybe there was more to the wreckage on Mac Brazel's farm.
Or maybe the official explanation, as straightforward as it is the truth. For better or worse, the Roswell incident is going to stay with us until people stop paying attention. Even though every theory is riddled with holes, it seems like people still want to believe.